안녕하십니까. 오늘 아시아 센터 콜로키움 저희 아시아 센터가 몇 가지 이런 아카데믹 미팅의 종류들이 있는데 포럼이 있고 콜로키움이 있고 워크숍이 있고 그렇습니다. 이제 콜로키움이라는 형태를 좀 새로 만들어서 너무 공식적이지도 않고 그렇다고 아주 인포멀하다는 그런 형태의 틀을 만들었습니다. 그래서 오늘 손호다 시베이토 동경대학교 교수님을 모시고 강연을 듣게 됐습니다. 손호다 선생님이 오시게 된 거는 지금 아시아 센터 아래서 글로벌 이스쿨이라는 프로그램이 진행되고 있습니다. 글로벌 이스쿨은 온라인과 오프라인으로 아시아 주요 대학들을 연결해서 강의를 하는 프로그램인데 저희 서울대학교의 경우에는 러시아의 두 대학, 그다음에 중국의 여러 대학, 일본의 여러 대학들과 연결되어 있고 앞으로 베트남, 인도네시아 이런 아시아 대학들과 이제 연결을 계획을 가지고 있는데 지금 이번 학기에 진행되고 있는 강의 중에 하나가 동경대, 북경대, 서울대를 연결하는 강의입니다. 저하고 손호다 선생님하고 북경대학의 왕 교수님하고 세 학교가 공동으로 강의 진행을 하고 있는 건데 그거의 일환으로 이번에 이제 오프라인으로 어제 강의를 하셨습니다. 오셔서 손호다 선생님 잠깐 소개를 드리면 전공이 이제 서예학이신데 지금 소속은 포지션을 말씀드리면 굉장히 많으세요. 동경대학이 저희 학교처럼 이렇게 학과가 뭐 정치학과, 서예학과 이렇게 돼 있기보다는 굉장히 인터디시플리너리한 성격이 많습니다. 그래서 영어로 그냥 읽어드리면 Interdisciplinary Information Studies, 또 Institute of Oriental Culture and Graduate School Interdisciplinary Information Studies의 교수이시고요. 또 IT 아시아라는 이것 역시 인터디스플레이 프로그램입니다. 거기에 디렉터이시고 또 Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia, 이게 그전에는 동양문화연구소라고 했는데 이제 최근에 아시아 고등연구소 이름을 바꾸었다고 합니다. 여기에 이제 소개해 계시고 또 Research and Information Center for Asian Studies의 데퓨티 디렉터로 계십니다. 그리고 와세다 대학에 계시다가 얼마 전에 동경대학으로 이제 옮겨 오셨고 저서를 몇 가지 말씀드리면 우선 전공 분야가 Comparative Sociology, Contemporary China Studies, Globalization of Cultures in Asia, Localization of Japanese Companies in Asia 이런 연구 주제와 분야에 연구하고 계시고요. 출간된 저서를 일본어로 된 거지만 영어로 말씀드리면 2012년 올해 Emerging Middle Classes in East Asia 책을 편집하셨고 2010년에 Can Education Solve Social Inequality 공저를 하셨고요. 이완함에서 2008년에 Social Inequality in Contemporary China 라는 책을 내셨고 이거는 20세기 아시아 태평양 연구의 저술상을 받으셨던 책입니다. 그다음에 2008년에 또 Where Chinese Society is Heading For 서브타이틀로 Dialogue with Chinese Sociologists라는 책을 요한아미시 호텔에서 또 편집하셨고요. 2006년에 Human Beliefs and Values in Thriving Asia 라는 책을 편집하셨고 2005년에 Economic Development and Social Change 이 책은 China Economy 시리즈의 일환으로 나고야 대학에서 나온 책인데 그걸 내셨습니다. 이런 저서 타이틀에서 보시듯이 방대한 영역에서 저술을 하셨고 특히 저희 오늘 강의와 관련해서는 아시아 바로미터라는 아시아 각국의 그 가치관과 밸리프를 비교 연구하는 데이터를 베이스로 구축하고 계신데 2003 그래서 이 4년마다 이렇게 축적을 하고 계신데 그것을 지금 현재는 책임을 지고 계신 교수입니다. 다른 선생님이 시작을 하셨다가 이제 은퇴하시고 손호다 교수께서 이제 그거를 지금 책임을 맡고 계셔서 오늘 그것과의 데이터를 여러 가지 활용하셔서 발표해 주셨습니다. 오늘 발표해 주신 타이틀은 Utilizing Different Social Capital in Different Social Settings, Comparative Analysis of Localization Process of Japanese, Korean and Taiwanese Multinationals in Mainland China from 2001 to 2010. 이런 제목으로 드리겠습니다. 그러면 손하다 시게이터 선생님 박수 한번 맞아주십시오.
감사합니다.
한국말을 잘 알아들으시고요.
I can listen to that speaker. Should I use the mic? Thank you for coming here. I can understand what Professor Myung-gu said, but unfortunately, in spite of my efforts to study Korean language, Hanguma, but it doesn't work well. So I'm very sorry that I'm going to use English to talk about the research findings, which is very kind of brand new. As Professor Myung-gu explained, I've been collecting a lot of comparative data that can cover mostly East Asian countries. But one of the difficulties is in comparing societies or countries or companies would be that, let's say, the Japanese experts on the Japanese multinationals don't know about Japanese companies, but most of them do not know why Japanese companies are different from Korean companies. And let's say I have a lot of Taiwanese experts who have been looking at Taiwanese companies. They call it Taishan, Taiwanese merchants operating in mainland China. But only few of them try to compare Taiwanese companies with Korean companies or Japanese companies. So today, I'd like to bring all the data together to see what sort of commonalities does the Japanese, Korean, and Taiwanese company multinationals have, or what sort of differences we have. But as I mentioned, all I can do is to prepare the data. But again, correcting the data is really one thing, but having a good interpretation is quite another thing. Today, I'd like to present, in my concluding part, I presented a very challenging hypothesis to grasp the characteristics of Japanese companies. Mainly, I really want to compare Japanese companies with Korean companies. But it seems to me that in spite of having a lot of commonalities, but still, Korean companies and Japanese companies seem to have different policies to push their localization process in mainland China. I'm now thinking of presenting the result in Nanking University in China. But whenever I try to make presentation based on this result, I have a strong kind of resistance from the mainland scholars from mainland China, because they think that Taiwanese is not multinational in mainland China. They think it's a kind of a domestic company rather than foreign company. But they don't mind anything about Japanese and Korean companies. But anyway, I'd like to see some commonalities and differences between Japanese, Korean, and Taiwanese companies by using different types of data. The concept of localization is really provocative and sometimes catch a lot of attention. As Professor Kang Myung-gu explained, my major is sociology, 사회학. But most of the researchers who shows interest in the process of localization are the experts of management. Most of the scholars of management, very roughly speaking, are interested in whether the companies or multinationals have been operating well or they are gaining benefit or not. So whenever I have an opportunity to present my paper or make presentation in front of the experts of management, they put the very same question. Okay, I understand what you said, but are the companies you are looking at are making profit or not? Okay, because I have to start from my own kind of personal history. My father came from a very poor family who were born in Kagoshima Prefecture. So he came up to Tokyo in early 50s, and he did a very good job, and he became very rich. But because of my conflict with my father, I refused to succeed his business. That's why I'm here. So whenever someone asks about the profit, I say, oh, it's not my business. It's my father's business. But anyway, but still I'm interested in the kind of company or multinationals, especially multinationals, because at the process of management or at the time of localization process, we can find very interesting interactions between the foreign expatriates and local workers. Let's say I have seen a lot of cases in Korean companies, but if the Korean company sends their businessmen from the headquarters in Seoul to Nanjing or to other part of China, they have to make communications. They have to work with the local workers, and they have to manage in some way or another. Then the problem is, let's say, what sort of language they use, or what sort of policies they use to encourage the local workers to work for that company. These questions, of course, are part of the, can be asked by the expert on management, but the communication issues or the interaction process per se should be the matter of the analysis by the sociologist. So I'm very much interested in the multinational issues, not from managerial or perspective, but from sociological perspective. And this is one thing for that I have to say about the importance of the concept of localization. But on the other hand, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan share some very kind of same phenomena. That is, we are witnessing emerging China, especially as a market, emerging market. So I know that I still remember when I was undergraduate in Tonggyeonghakkyo, only small number of students chose Chinese as a second foreign language. But right now, around 50% of the newly recruited students will choose Chinese language. And the same can be said to the students in Seoul National. More and more students want to study Chinese Mandarin, and some of the rich families send their sons and daughters to China and send them to the international school to learn not only English but also Mandarin as well. And when I was in Waseda, I recruited one student from the IHA who studied English as well as Chinese. And she has been studying Japanese very well. She's now staying in the United States after getting married to the Thai student in Waseda. So the Korean students are becoming very much international. But what I want to say is that they are paying very cautious attention to emerging China and Japan too. When I was undergraduate at the University of Tokyo, a lot of Sonde asked me, why you are interested in China? You are studying sociology, right? Sociologists, in many cases, are not interested in Asian studies. that was that things are very common about 30 years ago. But right now, more and more sociologists or social scientists in general in Japan have come to pay attention to China. There are so many disputes diplomatically as well as economically. So again, Taiwan has a very kind of delicate, complicated relations with mainland China. The President Ma Ying-jeou has been promoting kind of exchange between Taiwan and mainland China, but still he keeps a very cautious attitude toward pushing too much putting Taiwan too much toward the so-called de facto integration with mainland China. So we are witnessing, on one hand, China market is a really charming, object for the neighboring countries. But at the same time, each country has very complicated relations with China. Not only in terms of territorial issues. I know that Korea has territorial issues with China, and Japan too. Taiwan also. So such, other than such political issues, but still, if you look at human resource management, again, there are some pros and contras. So I'd like to look at the managerial process or psychological status quo, both Taiwan side, foreign side and Chinese side, to see what's happening in the multinationals, Korean, Japanese, Taiwanese multinationals operating in China. But the process of localization itself is a very historical one. But if you have a chance to look at the kind of researches conducted by the experts of management, most of them try to use a kind of data of just one time. They distribute a questionnaire and ask how much they think their localization has been completed, but just by using one time, which is I don't think it's a good policy, because localization is a historical process. So ideally speaking, we have to get some chronological data to show what happens in these companies. Let's take one example. I had many opportunities to make interviews with the Japanese businessman in China. But whenever I paid a visit to the Japanese multinationals in China, the Japanese managers said, Professor Sonoda, our company has to seek for more localization. They say the same thing repeatedly. But without getting the chronological data, we cannot say anything about whether or their aims has been completed or not. So, just paying one visit is very dangerous to see whether localization has been taking place. Well, what sort of localization we are witnessing? So, as I mentioned, ideally speaking, chasing some companies, for a decade or for 2 decades would be very necessary. And our research started, I should say, by accident, after drinking a lot of beers with my Korean colleagues and Taiwanese colleagues, after having a symposium in Tokyo. After drinking too much, we came to the conclusion that we are going to, it's a really good idea to push this comparative research. But after getting the data in 2000, in the year 2000, everyone was, at that time, the data was not complete, was not ideal. But after 8 years interval, our colleagues met together again and talked about the feasibility of conducting a chronological survey research just by chasing the same company that we visited. And Okay, we collected the data both in 2001 and 2010. So we can see the 9 years change. What sort of change we can see can be gotten by comparing the data that we collected collectively in 2010 and 2001. But I have to explain about what sort of aspects we are going to pay attention to. I'm thinking of three aspects as a very important key concepts in our collaborative research. One is the language and communication program. And I know that Professor Khan is has been working for the Department of Communication. But sometimes language problem has been utilized as an excuse of not respecting the local workers. Okay, but there might be several different strategies about the use of language. Let's say there might be 3 ways. Okay, taking the Korean case, for example, there might be 3 ways to cope with the language issues. One is to use English. Whether they are in Beijing or Nanjing. 2 is to use a local language, that is, using Chinese language. And finally, using Korean language. Then, which language are you going to use? It would be a matter, even though you think it's just a kind of matter of language, but it has to do with personnel policy. And if you try to compare Korean case and Japanese companies or Korean companies, we can see some very interesting contrast. But anyway, language communication would be one of the 3 important key concepts. The second concept is social capital and trust, which I mentioned in my title. I had the opportunity to present the same kind of topic in front of my Taiwanese colleagues. Taiwanese colleagues seem to have very prideful feelings that Taiwanese are more advantageous in making the kind of trust relationship with the people in mainland China because of their sharing the same language as well as the history. But you might be very surprised to know that the formation of social capital or trust formation shows different. I was really amazed that Korean businessmen have the strongest network with the local officials, much better than Japanese and Taiwanese, which surprised a lot of Taiwanese audience as well. And finally, I'd like to look at mostly the local workers' evaluations throughout companies. We prepare the same content of questionnaires which are distributed to the companies, the Japanese and Taiwanese and Korean companies, and ask the local workers to evaluate, let's say, which companies they want to work for, or whether they are satisfied with working conditions offered by Korean, Taiwanese, and Japanese companies. We just try to compare and to find what sort of commonalities we are facing, or what sort of differences are there in terms of local people's or local workers' evaluation throughout the companies they are working for. Okay, I'd like to make a brief introduction of the research design and data, how we collected the data. As I mentioned, we after drinking, the research or project will start from drinking. And I had a good friend of mine working for the Department of Sociology at Harinkyo, Professor Park Junsi, was one of the good friend of mine who also drinks well. But anyway, he proposed the first project, which launched since 2000 to 2002, which was a 3-year project. Supported by Japan Society for Promotion of Science financially. And that time, we had a lot of discussions about the selection of the place where we conduct research. And as you know, many Korean companies have their branches and or factories in Dongbek, northeast part of China. But Taiwanese companies are more concentrated on southern part of China. So the Taiwanese says, oh, it's better to conduct research in Guangdong or Fujian. But Korea says, oh, it's not a good idea. Let's go to Liaoning or Jilin. So their proposals are totally different. So we, after discussing how to control industry, how to control the size of the company we are visiting, we decided to go to the Suzhou city in Jiangsu province. So in this stage, we decided a place and a company we are targeting. And after, as I mentioned, after 9-year interval, and we're still in the process of collecting the data and interpreting the data. But from 2009 to now, have been we are now in the second stage to collect the data from the headquarters, from the offices, factories in China, and mainly targeting the experts sent by the headquarters in China, in Korea, Japan, and China, and as well as the questionnaires for the local workers working for these three companies. So basically, I collected 3 different types of data. But today, I'd like to focus on the data of expatriates and the local workers as well, to see what happened during these 9 years. This is a number of samples of foreign expatriates. Because in year 2001, we just visited the several companies just only in Suzhou, Jiangsu province. But because we have relatively rich amount of money for the second stage, we visited several companies operating in Guangdong province, which is in the south part of China, very near to Hong Kong. So in the second stage, we try to see some geographical differences. But today, because this time I'm interested in chronological changes, I just pick up the Suzhou part of the 2010 data. But you can see that the data of 2001 has a very small number of samples from Korea and Taiwan. I really understand the reason why there's so small number. But I still remember not only Taiwanese but also Chinese at the time, 2001, seems to be very careful. They are very much sensitive about being interviewed. But of course, sometimes after drinking, especially the Korean businessman talks a lot about what sort of difficulties they are facing. But there's a limitation because I cannot drink every day, so it naturally means that our target, our sample could increase dramatically. But this, as far as the data of 2010 is concerned, partly because of the more kind of friendly treatment by the Korean businessman, but partly because of my partner, Professor Park's efforts, we could collect as many as 122 samples from Korean businessmen. You might you might think that the number is still small in scale. But getting access to the businessman is really hard thing, because sometimes physically they are busy, but sometimes they are not strongly motivated to talk with the professors who want to dig in some confidential things. Let's say what sort of conflicts you have, what sort of impression you have, image you have for the local workers or something. So some of the businessmen are very much hesitating to speak with the professors, even though they respect us. But anyway, as far as the data of 2010 is concerned, we could collect around 100 samples, which I think is large enough to talk something. As to the local workers, yes, number is more large because they have a larger number of workers. And just remember that even the let's say the large-scale multinationals of Korean companies like LG or Samsung or whatever, they don't have so many expatriates. Even Samsung, they have at most 30 or something. So it's rather difficult for me to get the samples from the foreign expatriates. But as to the local workers, rather easy. But in order to conduct the survey, we need to get a permission from, again, the expatriates. But anyway, we corrected that number. And finally, we paid a visit to the companies. But after the process of chasing the companies, we found several interesting differences. As to the Japanese companies, they, all three companies that I visited in 2001 were still operating there without changing. But as to Taiwanese, all of them changed their factories. They went more into inward because they're very much sensitive about the labor cost. So, none of the companies were there. So we couldn't help changing the companies by sticking to the same industry. So the data of Taiwan, at the time of reading the data of Taiwan, you have to be very, very careful because the companies we surveyed are different. Because, as I mentioned, no Taiwanese company stayed in the same venue in the city of Suzhou. Korean companies, because, I'm not sure whether I have to say it, but we paid a visit to Samsung, anyway. And Samsung, at the first meeting of the second round, the manager seems to be very, very cautious. Even after drinking too much. Yes. Said, okay, I know you're interested, but I'm now accepting so many guests, so many scholars are watching us. Okay. But after a while, after 3 days, he finally permitted us to distribute a questionnaire as well, not only to the local workers, but also for the expatriates sent by headquarters in Korea. But other companies, they just refused. It seems to me that the Korean companies in 2001 were more generous, were more friendly. But right now, because they are regarded, most of the large companies operating in China seem to be regarded as a good company, or a leading company, or a leading global company. They are more cautious, much more cautious than ever. Yes, this is the map of China. As I mentioned, we paid a visit to the Suzhou area in 2001 and 2010, and because of the budget issue, we could go to the Guangdong area in 2010 to 2011 to compare the two cities or two regions in China. Okay, I'm not sure how much you're familiar with multinationals operating in China, but I prepared 3 threads. This is a picture I took in some companies, and this one and that one. Okay, which is the Korean company? Well, I should say that one sheet for one company, one Japanese, one Korean, one Taiwanese. Can you see some differences?
Some is very friendly and very.
This one? So which company?
This one looks like
Korean. Why?
This is Stanley.
Oh,
It's not common in Japan. Furniture.
oh, oh,
그리고
oh.
it's
Excellent observer. Yes, that is. These pictures are taken in Korean. And which one? Taiwanese or Japanese? How come? Why?
story. The right one. And the left one is Stanley. Style.
The style. Would you explain what sort of style?
It's a uniform.
Uniform.
No, is it?
Sometimes the Taiwanese also wear uniform. Well, you can get the kind of answer just by looking at the portrayals of the expatriates. I'll say these pictures are taken in Japanese, and I have to say that average age of the Japanese expatriates are extremely old. Yes, these pictures suggest me that those Japanese working in the Japanese factories operating in China are very old. You can see the changes. And these pictures are taken in Taiwanese companies. And most of the Taiwanese companies are very small in size, very flexible in many ways, as I mentioned. As long as they think that it's not a good idea to stay in one state, in one city, they move. And they're very much familiar with the local rules. So once the city government or the township government change the law of the labor cost, then they think of changing the venue for the operation. But most of them, have a very frequent communication or frequent transportation between the mainland China and Taiwan. Whenever I have a chance to talk with how frequently they go back to Taiwan, most of them said 6 times annually, which is much more frequent than the Japanese or Korean counterpart. Okay, I prepared 20 figures so that we can think of some commonalities and differences. The first figure shows about the composition of gender of the expatriates. Still, I should say that the Korean expatriate and Taiwanese expatriate are male dominant. But within these 9 years, Korea and Taiwan have come to send female expatriates. Not so much drastically, but if you look at Japanese, no change. And I have to say that I have conducted that kind of research since 1991. But until now, I haven't seen any Japanese female expatriates working especially in the manufacturing companies. So it's perfectly male-dominant business as far as the Japanese expatriates are concerned. But if you look at Korea, Taiwan, we can see some changes. And again, if you look at age, you can see very interesting trends. Korea, those in the 50s are minority. And if you look at Taiwanese, they have come to send more youngsters, which is quite natural. After making a lot of interviews with the owner of the business, the Taiwanese call it Laoban. But when I have a talk with the Laoban, they said it's quite common for the newly recruited Taiwanese graduates of the universities can be easily sent to the mainland just after recruited in the headquarters in Taiwan. But if you look at Japan, more than 2/3 are over 50 years old. And it really matches my image. Do you know the reason why?
They hire more local staff or
Well, this is really true. But do you think it is kind of a result of intentional decision? Or is it because of accidental reason? Yes, what you said is really true. The Japanese company have come to retain the workers, local workers, to work longer for their subsidiaries. But do you know why?
when I was in Beijing, somebody told me the Japanese company employees don't want to go to the foreign region.
That's right. That's one of the biggest reasons that our informants in Japanese company told. So those who have been working in the Japanese, let's say if you have a look at their pictures, even though the length of service for the company is short, but they are moving from one factory to another in the same Chinese market. So even though the length of service for that company is short, but they are moving from one factory to another. Because according to their explanation, there are more youngsters who can succeed their business. Okay? So, Japanese companies are now facing some difficulties to recruit the Japanese, young employees who might go to the Chinese market to do their business. Okay, again, Korea. So this picture is very interesting. It's connotes a very interesting kind of situation. If you look at Korea, those who got university diploma, occupies more than 90%, which hasn't changed at all within these 9 years. But if you look at Japan, and if you look at Taiwan, the expatriates are not necessarily the holder of a degree in universities. Of course, it might reflect the very high percentage of Korean, people going up to universities. But such large percent of the degree holders of Korea suggest something which shows different picture with Taiwanese and Japanese. But interestingly, if you look at the year of service, we cannot see any great changes or differences across time or across regions. So basically the average length of stay in the Chinese market would be just 3 to 5 years. So even the Koreans are saturated. But this shows another different picture. Okay, the change are very slight, but if you try to compare Korean cases and Japanese cases, it's quite evident that Korean expatriates try to bring the family. But and again, it has something to do with age, because in Korean expatriates are much younger than the Japanese. But other than that, Japanese businessmen, they are not bringing their family to the Chinese market. Again, it has something to do with non-managerial conditions. We had a lot of meetings with the Japanese businessmen and asked them why they didn't bring their family. And most of them said, because of my sons and daughters' education. But, when we had a meeting with the Korean businessmen, they say the same thing for different questions. Why did you bring your family? They said, that's for my sons and daughters' education. So the purpose, the reason of the saying is same, but the phenomena are different. So, because the Japanese expatriates want to stay, want their sons and daughters stay in Japan, they come to the Chinese market alone, without bringing their families. And most of them are in their 50s. So their sons must be independent, but they must be in university or in high school. But I'm not sure why the Japanese businessmen didn't bring the families. But they say, most of them say, because their wives resisted. You go alone. I will not follow you. But in case of Korean businessmen, I haven't heard any stories about the kind of strong resistance by the Korean wives. They just say, okay, I'll be there and bring my sons and daughters to China. So, even though the phenomena of expatriates are the same, but the mentality of the expatriates seems to be very different just between Korea and Japan. Let's have a look at the local workers aspects. It has something to do with the different strategies taken by the Japanese company and Chinese and Korean companies. But as I mentioned, I try to go to the same kind of company. So in that sense, Taiwan data are not trustable. For this, I just prepare Taiwan data for your reference. So mainly we have to compare Korean data and Japan data. But it's quite evident that Japanese companies have so large number of those who have been working for the same companies for a long time. Korean case, yes. Older people's percentage increased, but not so dramatically as the Japanese case. And if you look at that figure, the situation is more dramatic. This shows the percentage of the completion of year of service for the same company. And it's quite evident that those who have been staying in the same company for more than 10 years in Japanese companies occupies more than 40%. Of course, the Japanese companies have a very strong kind of creed to let their workers stay in the same company. But a Korean company, they also are encouraging their workers to stay at the same company. But we can see some differences. But if you look at Taiwan, no change. And most of the workers have year of service within 3 years. In other words, the turnover rate is very high in Taiwan, followed by Korean companies, and Japanese companies have the lowest fluidity of the personnel. Should I? Okay. The figure of 4 tells about the running experience of Chinese. Okay. Sure.
15
Okay. Okay, now stop somewhere.
540.
Okay. Right. If you look at the figure 8, Korean expatriates have come, within these 9 years, have come to learn Chinese, but no change about for the Japanese expatriates. Professors in Chinese, Koreans are more fluent of Chinese language, much better than the Japanese. So, if you have a look at the picture, these Japanese are more kind of technology oriented. They are minding about skills formation and technological issues, without saying anything about personal issues, because they think it's really difficult to manage people who has different values and different perceptions. But as to the Korean people, they try to learn much harder than the Japanese counterpart. And again, very interestingly, still more than 30% of the Korean expatriates says that they don't need any assistance of the translator. But as to the Japanese, no. It's very difficult to manage without the support of the translator of Chinese in Japanese company. And of course, Taiwan shows very different picture. But again, if you try to compare Korea and Japan, Korean experts seems to be more ardent in acquiring and using Mandarin, much better than the Japanese. And this tells about the percentage, the situation of the understanding of expatriates' mother tongue. In Korea, the local workers in Korean company have come to learn slightly about the Korean language, but as to Japanese companies, decreased. it seems very contradictory. As I mentioned, the percentage of those who have been working for the companies, in the Japanese company for a long time, increased. But those who have a good command of Japanese decreased. But it's not a kind of contradiction. But after checking the cross-stuff, I found that Japanese companies have been witnessing a kind of bipolarization. Those who have been staying in the company have a much better of Japanese, but others have been changing. They have a very high turnover rate. Yes, frequency of communication. Okay, we have to skip something. But most of them, most of the local workers can, understand the manager's direction. But in case of Japan, most of the message delivered by the managers were through the translation. Okay, next slide. As I mentioned, if you try to find out, if you try to measure the social capital in China, by the extractives sent from Korea, Taiwan, Japan, the Korean data is in the left, and Taiwan in the middle, Japan in the left, in the right. And if you try to find out the percentage of those who have friends in local government, Korea have the most, followed by Taiwanese and Japanese. This tendency hasn't changed, even though the percentage has decreased in the Korean data. And I asked Korean people why they have friends in local governments. And in most cases, they just smile and say, "Oh, without having friends in local government, you cannot do your business." But the Japanese also say the same thing. Without knowing the local governments, without having any network with the local government, they find it very difficult to manage in the Japanese company as well. But I asked them what sort of policies you're doing. Most of the Japanese said, "Oh, it is not my business. It is my subordinate's business." So the Japanese are asking the local workers who have working for the Japanese company for a long time to get access to the local officials. So they try to make a very clear distinction and division of labor. So Japanese are mainly in charge of communicating with the headquarters. But as to more kind of local things, management of the people who are contact with the local officials, they leave such things to the hands of the local workers. But as to the Koreans, they try to do it by themselves, without using, or with little use of the local workers. But interestingly, Taiwan doesn't have such kind of network, and I asked them why there are so few friends. But they think, they think that the concept of friends are too heavy. They think that I have so many acquaintances there, but they are not friends, which shows a kind of very delicate, very sensitive kind of social distance with the local officials. Okay. Yes, if you have a look at this, you can find how complicated the social distance between Taiwanese and Chinese are there. Even though there are slight difference, a slight change between 2001 and 2010. If you compare Taiwanese businessman with the Japanese businessman and Korean businessman, they think that Taiwanese human relations are a little bit complicated. So seen from the foreigners, the Korean, it's quite, I thought it's quite natural for the Taiwanese businessman to communicate with mainlanders or people in mainland, or to have to make friends. But seen from Taiwanese expatriates or businessmen, they still think it's quite hard to make some communication with the local officials. So that's why right now, Taiwanese seems to be losing their kind of contact with the locals. So, but very paradoxically, if you compare Korea and Taiwan, Taiwanese businessmen shows more, efforts. They are paying more efforts to create kind of relations with the local workers as well as local, officials. So the Taiwanese still have a very kind of doubtful eyes to the local workers. Okay, the time is skipping. But finally, I want you to have a look at that last slide, figure 12. The question itself is very simple. If you can, this is the answer made by the local workers. If you can choose freely which company you want to work for, you want to work, and if you look, even though Korean Chinese workers working for the Korean company have come to understand foreign language, but the percentage of those who chose Korean company decreased. And in every company, those who chose national company, Chinese company, increased. So, judging from the data, and after correcting the result of the interview data, I found that Korean businessmen or managers seems to be having some still difficulty in retaining the local workers. So they are encouraging their local workers to stay, and they prepare many opportunities to learn Korean language. Sometimes they make a kind of official kind of meeting to encourage the Korean proficiency in the company. But local Korean businessmen are still wondering whether the workers working for the Korean companies will stay in the company. But as to the Japanese, of course, some of the managers clearly complain that it's rather difficult to retain a good smell of the local workers. But compared with Korea, Japanese companies seems to be more stable, or seems to be in a more advantageous position to get relatively high quality personnel from the Chinese labor market. So finally, after looking at these results, I found that of course the Korean, Japanese, and Chinese companies share very similar trends. But if I dare prepare some different ideal types, we can say that there are three different types in Taiwan, Korea, Japan, respectively. Taiwan seems to be bringing in their way of management directly, so they don't have to worry about something different. But if you look at Japan, even though they understand that they have to do something for the localization, but partly because of the lack of linguistic ability or lack of interest of their staying in China, they try to utilize the core local workers to manage their local subsidiaries. But in case of Korea, Korean companies, they try, most of the headquarters are expecting the expatriates to manage everything. I'm not sure it is a result of their intention or it is the result of accident. Because even the expatriates from Korea says that they want to recruit highly talented personnel to be a would-be manager in Korean company operating in China. But still, they think one of the most important conditions for the local workers to be a manager is the language problem, because they think they need to have a cross contact with the Korean headquarters. But what they are saying, I mean, what the Japanese and Koreans are saying are basically the same. But because of the lack of supply from the young workers from Japan, Japanese labor market, Japanese company cannot help making some division of labor between the expatriates and local workers. So I don't think it's the result of intention, but accidentally, the Japanese, because of the lack of personnel from the Japanese labor markets, Japanese companies cannot help using the power of local workers. So even though the Korean, Japan, Japanese company are facing the same difficulties, the same situation, but the way in which they adapt to their conditions shows a relatively different picture. Of course, have to explain, have to check whether my expression is really good or not. And we have to check why such differences come up. And one possibility, I guess, is the different structure of the labor market or the connection between the university and the labor market. In other words, I still think that Korean universities are still providing a very talented personnel to the labor market who can do management very well in mainland China. But most of the Japanese multinationals almost gave it up to recruit the Japanese youngsters to do such a thing. So they have changed their mind to recruit international students to be would-be expatriates for the Japanese markets. So sometimes I find that an international student from China can easily find a job in the Japanese market. So, but Japanese students find it very difficult to find a job. So in my eyes, I'm very wondering why the Japanese university students change their mind and try to study as hard as Korean university students. But nothing changed. But anyway, the educational system or educational market might partially explain the different strategy of adaptation in the changing Chinese market. But anyway, we are still in a stage where whether my observation is right or not. I'm not sure whether this ideal type can really explain the differences between Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. Really appreciate if you can make a fruitful comment from you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Sanada. It was quite interesting presentation. 한국말로 하겠습니다. 선생님들 말하는 들으시거든요. 그러니까 우선 학생들이 많이 와주셔서 학생들 한 두 분 좀 먼저 기회를 드리겠습니다. 거꾸로 하겠습니다. 그리고 선생님들 오시는 학생들 두 분 정도 먼저 질문이나 코멘트. 언어는 영어로 하셔도 좋고 한국어로 하셔도 좋고 중국 가시니까 중국어로 하셔도 좋습니다. 그리고 중국어로 할 경우는 한국말을 스스로 통일해주십니다. 자기소개 잠깐 해주시고 하시죠. 소속이나 이름.
My name is Park Joo-hyung, and I'm in the Department of Sociology.
Oh.
And I'm in the Master's program.
I really envy you because I have one course I taught in the graduate school of sociology in Todai. But once I tried to use English, they ran away.
I have a simple question. I wonder, the multinational companies you survey, are they in the same industrial sector?
Yes. They are producing electric devices.
What are the number of samples?
Pardon me?
How large the number of samples?
I mean, the number of companies, right? This, not so many.
또 한 번 더 하시죠. 없으시면 이제 선생님께 다 오픈 하시죠. 이천표 선생님이 사실은 경제학 하시는 선생님들이 이걸 좀 들으셔야 한국의 경제에 좀 기여하실 것 같은데 경제학자는 이런 데는 좀 별로 관심이 없으니까 내가 이천표 선생님을 제외해야 합니다. 예외적인 선생님이시니까. 근데 뭐 그렇게까지는 못하는 거죠.
네. Then I was speaking English. Long ago, I taught the subject of multinational corporation, and at the time, the image of multinational corporation is a very big company working globally, intercontinentally. So the first impression is that your multinational company owned or came from Korea, Taiwan, Japan, may not be the orthodox multinational company doing business globally. It is a multinational in the sense they are multinational in the sense that the company works across the countries and employees are at least two nationality. Having said that, that's my impression. And then concerning your research finding, I wonder how important is the weight of the social capital, which you talked about this afternoon, in comparison with the or more orthodox economic capital. I think multinationals you mentioned in China are mainly they're seeking profit.
Yes.
So they are the first their prime demand of interest is economics,
Right.
not sociology or social relations or social capital you mentioned. So I would like to know how do you think is the weight of the social capital in comparison with the economic capital? And the related thing is that economic capital, if the economic weight of the economic capital is bigger than that of the social capital, their role of the economic capital should outweigh the things you have found through your research. So I would like to know your view on the usefulness of your finding, contribution of your finding to the working of the multinational.
Okay, thank you for your kind of very difficult questions. It's rather difficult to compare economic capital and social capital. It's rather difficult to wait to judge which is more important for the success of the business. But the reason about paying attention to social capital is very simple. Because since 1991, when I started this kind of research, most of the businessmen who were sent to China, they say, maintaining or establishing friendship or relations are one of the most important things in commerce. Of course, some researchers say that if the market develops, such partner relations will not become important. But making a lot of interviews to find that such statement didn't come up, especially from the expatriates or the business experts who have been doing that business. But of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that economic capital is not important. I'm not saying so. But today I didn't prepare that slide. But if I ask not to the Korean businessman, but also to the Japanese businessman and Chinese businessman, how do they think it is important to use human relations to their own business? Very interestingly, the evaluation is extremely high in Chinese market. So most of the businessmen think as a kind of, we use a kind of quotation mark, with the common sense that maintaining or utilizing some personal network, well, once in Chinese, for their successful management. But again, the human beings, economic animal. I mean, they're acting economically rationally. But probably the reason of my paying attention to social capital is my kind of personal bias as a sociologist, not as an economist. But again, as I mentioned, the reason of paying attention to that social capital is because of my own experience that I have a lot of episodes from the businessmen who work with the Chinese partners who said that establishing such a network is of vital importance for the business.
또 자유롭게 말씀하시죠. 지금 소개하시죠.
I'm a professor, Suki Kong, in SNUAC. Last year, I joined the project about concerning on the image between the Chinese and the Japanese. How the Japanese government promotes the Japanese image toward the Chinese people. So I had a chance to look at the survey data. So the Japanese government should have a survey of the images, how it changed the Japanese is how to think about China. But the attitude or the image toward China among the Japanese it's not good. This is
Constantly decreasing.
Yeah, and recently I think it's more rapidly decreasing. The reasons why I think is the Japanese people feel kind of threatened because China is a G2. It's emerging.
So they call it Beijing consensus.
Yeah. But Chinese, so relatively saying, is they don't like the Japanese because of the historical reason. But it's not the attitude toward Japan is not decreasing. It's relatively low, but it's okay. So the public opinion, people, they don't like it. In general, the Japanese don't like it. China. So this is a public opinion. Also, the Japanese government using the media, all kinds of media, to criticize China. So there's a lot of it's not unfriendly atmosphere amongst Japanese. So this kind of feeling and attitude make them the Japanese young or younger generation or the people, the ordinary people want to go to China. But this is my this is the general atmosphere or general obstacle for the big challenge for the Japanese company to do business in China.
It's true. It's true that Japanese people have come to have a more kind of worse image of China. But on the other hand, as I said, the youngsters who get enrolled in universities have come to learn Chinese for their own purposes. But it doesn't, contribute to the increase of the numbers who want to go to Chinese market. So, it's really complicated.
Also, I had the data also the ODA, the Japanese, that doesn't the program ODA in China. But I was shocked by the data, number of how many, the staff member, the Japanese staff member stay in China. Only a few. This is the one indicators is why Japanese is struggling to promote this social capital trust among Chinese people. They agree. Yeah, exactly. This is the ODA program really helpful in the beginning, but they don't like Japanese because this is a strategy. Because only a few staff members in there, and they just visiting program. So 1,000 or 100 students or the people just visit their program, but they return only for a short period.
Right.
So there's So this is one. So they don't care about pay attention about developing 1.0.
Right.
This is,
But when I had a kind of joint B-class with Professor Khan, I used a method of a student survey, which I conducted in 2008, which tells about the students in Todai and Wasuda's mentality. But very roughly speaking, they showed interest in going to foreign universities, but many of them want to go home after completion of the program. So it's a very kind of general term, whether they go to China or to the US or to the other countries. So of course, Sino-Japan relations must be influencing on the Japanese, especially youngsters, very kind of negative, passive attitudes. But it's not only to the case of sending and going to China.
The few, couple of observations and also two questions. My impression about these Japanese youth, very introverted attitude, refusing to go abroad for study or employment. I guess it's partially related with the fact that Japan has actually neoliberalized much less than in Korea. So for Korean youth, there is no really the alternative to searching for jobs overseas and going overseas for and then the corporate ownership these days, like Samsung, and all these companies are about 50% foreign owned, and so on. So the whole nature of Korean economy is very much cosmopolitanized, globalized, inside Korea and outside. So this is not just cultural issue, but also this is observation. My question, the first question is, do you have data on the work intensity and labor disputes of the companies you surveyed?
At the time of the interview, we include several questions about labor dispute issues, but in the questionnaire I didn't, because especially when you just remember that in the beginning, from the end of 2009 to the beginning of 2010, there are a lot of labor disputes in Korean, Japanese, and Taiwanese companies. So the Taiwanese experts wanted to include the question about labor dispute issues in the questionnaire, but after discussing a while, we found that it's not a good idea to include that question because it's still transient. At the time of distributing the questionnaire, it was
the reason why I'm asking that bring that issue is there are two things. The two significant differences between Japanese and the Korean companies. The first is the Korean, Chinese employees not wanting to work too long with Korean companies as compared to Japanese companies. Secondly, the amount of the social capital, including their contact with local officials and so on. I wonder whether actually without really watching these companies in China, but I guess the same differences will exist domestically, I guess. The Japanese workers will like to or will be able to work much longer with Japanese companies than Korean companies, Korean workers, the Korean companies, because of this employment system, also labor disputes and work intensity and so on. So even within Korea, Korean workers don't really work too long with their companies. I have very hard data on this. So, and secondly, about the social capital, mixing with local officials and all these things, right? It's kind of the business and government collusion. In Korea, it's still very important. But I heard that Japan has kind of changed it very significantly in this respect. And it's kind of interesting that this kind of business state collusion and also local communal engagements, local engagements, all these characteristics have been explained, used to be explained in terms of Japanese style management.
Right.
But Japanese companies are not so much like that, while Korean. So this is kind of very simplistic Western way of looking at the situation, I guess. So.
Thank you for your comments. Yes, I still remember that when we made an interview with the Korean businessman, why you have so many friends there? They say, simply, most of them say, I'm simply accustomed to it. It means that they are doing what they have done here in Korea. So it seems to me that they are not making some, great changes, but in some cases, in some extreme cases, they don't show that they are doing something different in the Chinese market. So in that sense, I agree the differences are not typically seen in the subsidiary in China, but it's just a reflection of the different characteristics of Korean companies.
Just one more thing. Can I see the social capital graph? Yeah, the lack or the shortage of Taiwanese managers connection with this local government officials.
Right.
I think this is my guess is this is related with the issue of the political sensitivity. Because I actually have read an article about this Chinese businessman's position in China and Taiwan. So there is a lot of not only this economic integration, but also huge nationalistic political maneuvering going on. So the Chinese, especially Chinese communists, are trying very hard to actually accommodate these Chinese people as potential partners for their national unification campaigns.
Right, partly true. But many of the Taiwanese are trying to negotiate with the local government through Taiwan Channel of commerce.
Yeah, that's why maybe they are very cautious not to directly engage with the politicians or peddlers, instead go through this.
Right. Sometimes they think that they need to make some individual negotiation, but in many cases they may try to make a very collective negotiation through channel of commerce. Yeah, I understand.
I would like to follow up on that same notion of social capital. In sociology, we use that term in relation to getting things done by utilizing the prior social ties. So, although I value the type of data you have here from such questions, whether it is the folks have friends in local business, foreign competition, Chamber of Commerce and local government. But I would like to suggest that you go maybe couple of steps forward. Whether they have utilized this friendship network to get things done. With business issues, they would not be able to kind of clear up without such a connection and friendship.
Yes.
So just having friends is one thing, but to get things done is another. So that way you could legitimately claim social capital. That's one observation.
Yes.
The other suggestion I would like to make has to do with controlling some or specifying the characteristics of these expatriates in terms of their ranks and grade in service and the personnel structure of different national firms, Korean, Taiwanese, and Japanese firms in China. They may have a different personnel structure. That may have an impact on the tenure and years of staying on the job and so on. And so some kind of cohort-specific, rank-specific, gender-specific, age-specific, company-specific turnover. Without such a specification or control of the related variables, the lump sum comparison may be a little bit problematic.
Okay.
And another comment I have is that whether or not the Korean Chinese play any role in the Korean companies. As Professor Lee pointed out, I would prefer to use offshore plants rather than multinationals. Considering the size and the nature of business, it seems to me offshore plants fits better than
using
multinationals.
Well, so the first question, you mentioned about 3 points, but to the first point, yes, I don't want to use that data to say completely about the kind of characteristics of the social capital. I just, use that data just to have a very rough picture of it. It's not a good idea to include the question like, did you use that, onesie to do your business in a question, which is not a good idea. So, to talk about making interviews, in a very kind of casual atmosphere, I put such kind of questions, and but of course, the cases are very limited in number, but I have the same kind of feeling that the meaning of having large number of friends means, in many cases, they are using it for some purposes. But of course, in order to verify it, we need to get more data about the interview. As to the second point, about the breakdown, yes, we have to do that. But now we are in a stage where we try to make a very rough picture rather than making very minute analysis. Because if you look at minute situation, probably the Korean expert can explain about what is happening in Korea, but Japanese and Chinese do not know anything about Koreans. So at this stage, we just want to we'll be doing our efforts whether we can find the same kind, we can share the same kind of picture shared by the researchers from 3 countries. And finally, you mentioned about offshore. Again, it has to do with different characteristics of the countries. I mean, whenever we do this kind of comparative analysis, if I use some categories, then it can explain about some part of the phenomena, but you cannot explain the other one. You mentioned about offshore, but speaking of the Japanese company, not so much, as far as the other data we collected are concerned. So whenever we try to think of the most appropriate expression to cover these these companies, it's another difficult business. If you say offshore, then you can explain about the user concepts, the Korean companies, and mostly the Taiwanese company too, but not so much in Japanese company. But anyway, comparing, the companies, it has been very challenging task given to me. Thank you.
질문 없으신데 마지막 한 분 있으시면 좋겠습니다. 공항에 가셔야 되기 때문에 길게 못 가겠는데 해주시죠.
Oh, you're also from sociology.
I have a short question. So, you looked at the social capital of Korean, Taiwan, and Japanese firms in China. But I'm wondering how each companies, for example, Korean companies doing business in Korea or in other countries in China, how they are developing social capital differently from Taiwan and Japan and for other countries.
But in order to answer that, these companies have to operate in different countries, right? I didn't prepare such kind of question. I know that you're interested in that. I'm not sure whether you can find good companies that can fully answer your question.
You said that the main reason Japanese companies having difficulty to find the young worker working in China is from the matter of the demand side. They don't want to work in overseas. But is there any the reason from the supply side? For example, I know that Japanese young workers unemployment rate is very high. That Japanese company don't want to hire Japanese young worker because of the, for example, lack of labor discipline or something like that. So is there any other reason other than the demand side from supply side?
There may be two possible factors that may be, impacting on the supply side. That is, one is university education. The second is the family strategy. In other words, of course, I haven't checked whether my observation or hypothesis is really true or not. But I'm thinking that one of the biggest reasons why the Japanese youngsters show little interest in going abroad or being sent abroad on the business basis is because they don't feel any pressure from the family. You know what I mean?
No.
No?
What do you mean by they have no pressure from family?
Yeah. Mostly the mother does not like the son and daughter go from their home. They want to retain them.
To run their family business?
I think so. Of course, in religion, family sociology, so we have to think the link of industrial sociology and family sociology. But I'm not sure.
From my experience,
On the basis of what you have found here, what can you say in terms of relative strengths of Japanese companies in Korea in terms of business performance, like complicating or helping the economy of the market or something?
Okay.
Or efficiency of this business?
Of course, the concept of efficiency is relatively difficult concept. In terms of the advantages or strong points, I can find several keywords. I can find several keywords. As to the Taiwanese, flexibility, very quick responses by the small kind of owners in the Baba. As to the Koreans, the quality of the expatriates, I think the best one compared with the Japanese. And as to the Japanese, only one factor, more advantage, that is technology. So if I didn't explain, I don't have enough time to explain about them. But I prepared some questions to the expatriates, what companies have been performing best in Chinese market? But more than 70%, no, more than 80% of Japanese respondents said that Taiwanese companies are doing best. But interestingly, as to Taiwanese, yes, those who chose the Taiwanese market are about 30%. But the rest, 40% chose Japanese companies doing this. But the reasons are very different. Chinese companies are looking at Japan with envying eyes that the Japanese are more technologically advantageous. So in the Taiwanese eyes, Japanese companies are doing well without doing special things. But in the eyes of Japanese, the Taiwanese seem to be very good in deciding a very quick response, in maintaining a flexibility, partly because of the language problem. But as to the Korean expatriates, their answers are just in between. But those who chose Korean as a good performer in mainland China are a smaller number. Even the answers from Korean.
This is intentional study that
Sorry, Professor, because he has to go to the airport. So I don't want to get him lost. 고맙습니다. 5월 말에는 또 요 같은 유사한 주제로 국경대학의 교수님 오셔서 또 강의 계획이 있습니다. 그때도 많이 와주시기 바랍니다. 고맙습니다.